If you're looking to spend between $40,000 and $60,000 on your next electric vehicle and your priority list includes the full federal tax credit, fast DC fast charging, and range up to 300 miles, you should definitely have the EV6 and the Ioniq 5 at the top of your shopping list. These two vehicles are very, very closely related. They share an incredible amount, but they're definitely styled differently and they're targeted at different shoppers. Let's take a look at the differences and, of course, what's the same. Obviously, the first thing you're going to notice is the design. The EV6 is a little bit pointier, a little bit sleeker. The hood drops down a little bit lower. The Ioniq 5 is trying to be a little bit boxier, but you'll notice that these aren't true boxy shapes. We have boxy headlights, but they're covered by a very smooth plastic sheet to give this the aerodynamics that an EV needs. Now, speaking of aerodynamics, the EV6 is the winner here, which is why it will get you about 9 to 10 miles of range more than the Ioniq 5, depending on the trim. And in real-world driving, you may actually be better than that in the EV6 if you do a lot of highway driving. On the other hand, the Ioniq 5 does have better headlights. These are projector-style LED headlights, and they definitely give off a bit more usable light than the reflector headlights that we find even in top trims of the EV6. I'm really torn as to the looks of these two vehicles. I love them both. I lean a little bit more towards the style of the Ioniq 5, but the functionality in terms of range of the EV6. Depending on the trim you're looking at, the Ioniq 5 changes a little bit less than the EV6. The look is a little bit more common from the bottom end trim to the top end trim, whereas the EV6 gets different bumpers, lower and different grille treatments depending on the version you get. Conventionally, these two vehicles are similar, but they're not identical. The Ioniq 5 is over 182 inches long. The EV6 is about 2 inches longer because of the sleeker profile. But most of the difference actually happens right back here. The wheelbase in the EV6 is significantly shorter than the Ioniq 5's. The Ioniq 5's wheelbase is actually longer than the Hyundai Palisade, which is a 3-row crossover. And the result of that combination is that we get a rear overhang that's about 6 inches longer than the EV6. You can see that it is very, very tight back here in the Ioniq 5. The shorter wheelbase means that this has a slightly tighter turning radius than the Ioniq 5, and it pays a bit of a dividend when it comes to cargo capacity in the rear. Both Kia and Hyundai call their vehicles crossovers. We have 6.1 inches of ground clearance, which is definitely below the new Kia Sportage and the Hyundai Tucson, which are both about the same size as these respective electric crossovers. An interesting touch is that we have the same wheel size and tire size, but different tires and wheels on each of these vehicles. 255, 45 R20s over there. Those are Michelin tires. Over here we have Continentals in the exact same size. Let me know what you think about the wheel styles down there in the comment section below. I'm not the biggest fan of black wheels, but I do prefer the design over here on the Kia. These have some aero covers here, so these little black spoke sections are actually plastic. They're not part of the alloy wheel itself, and then both have hidden lug nuts in the center. Both vehicles feature the same pop-out door handles. The Ioniq 5 has this sort of silver trim rather than black trim around the wheel arches. And if you're a fan of black wheel arch trim, you can get that in the EV6, but the top-end model does not have that particular feature. Instead, these are body-colored. From this angle, you can definitely see the lower roofline in the EV6. It also slopes a bit more towards the rear, and then we have a slightly more raked hatch, although both of these hatches in reality are a little bit more raked than the exterior profile in the Ioniq 5 would indicate. We have full LED taillights in both models, red turn signals on both models as well. And depending on exactly how you look at the rear end, the EV6 has a bit more of a sportback or liftback, perhaps even quasi-sedan look than the definitely hatchback profile that we find in the Ioniq 5. Now, if you didn't already know it, this EV6 is the one that I bought recently for long-term review here at Alex Autos. We're probably going to keep this between 1 and 3 years and see how well it does. I was very, very torn between getting an EV6 and getting an Ioniq 5, and to be perfectly honest, for me, it all came down to which one could I get my hands on first. That ended up being the EV6. So if you're torn between these two vehicles too, I do not blame you at all. It's a very, very difficult decision. Well, we're out back. Let's talk about charging. The charge door in the Ioniq is right over here on the passenger side. J1772 and CCS fast charge connector. Little display there to show you how the battery is charging. Over here in the EV6, it's a little bit further towards the rear. Same sort of powered charge door, although it opens to the side. Same sort of J1772 and DC fast charging connector there, and a little display to tell you how things are going. One interesting thing here is that we also have a button to start and stop the charging there that we don't find in the EV6. And both of them have the same plug to cover the DC pins. I really wish this was more of a door arrangement because that's kind of annoying to have that flopping around there. Both vehicles have interestingly shaped keys. The one in the Hyundai is very round. One thing that I like here is that there's a button to open and close the charge door. Something that for some reason, despite its size, we don't find on the Kia's key. Now this Kia key is inside one of these little key wrap things. That's not what it looks like normally, it's just the black plastic there. But you'll notice there's no button to open and close the charge door. Both have the smart park system where you can move the vehicle forward and backward only from the outside. They also have remote start, just no button for that charge door here. Mechanically, the EV6 and the Ioniq 5 are very similar. Kia is, after all, essentially a division of Hyundai. When designing these two vehicles, they first designed the platform, and then Hyundai and Kia were allowed to go off and design their respective vehicles based on a common set of components. And those common components included the battery packs. There are 3 worldwide, but only 2 of them are coming to the United States, the smallest one and the largest one. The smallest one is 58 kilowatt hours. The larger one is just over 77. At the moment, both models share the same motor units, and they both come in 3 different power levels. If you get the standard range battery pack, that's 168 horsepower. If you get the extended range battery pack, you have the choice of rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive with a dual motor setup. Both of these vehicles are the 320 horsepower all-wheel drive model. You'll get the biggest range in the big battery rear-wheel drive model, which gives you 225 horsepower. And due to the greater aerodynamics, the larger range figure will happen over here in the EV6, 310 miles of range in that rear-wheel drive format, 274 if you choose the dual motor setup like this one is. Over here we get 256 miles if you choose the dual motor setup, and just barely over 300 miles if you choose the single motor rear-wheel drive version. A little bit later this year, the same building blocks that we find in these 2 vehicles are going to build a number of other full electric vehicles from Hyundai and Kia. They include the Kia EV9, a large 3-row crossover, the Genesis GV60, the luxury relative to these 2 vehicles, also an Ioniq 6, a sedan variant based on the components of this Ioniq 5. After that, Hyundai and Kia have collectively promised a bevy of full electric models, and all of them seem to be focused on space efficiency, which is why we don't find much of a front trunk in either of these. We have the same sort of pizza box style thing going on here. There's enough room to put things like your California Duster, the vehicle to load connector, maybe the EVSE if you have one and want to travel with one right there, but not a lot of additional storage space. That's because the hood is very, very short in both of these vehicles, and they really wanted to maximize packaging efficiency. Now, when we're talking about EVSEs, you should know that you get one in the Hyundai, you do not get one from the factory in the Kia. But interestingly enough, the Kia comes with the vehicle to load adapter, which will allow you to power 1800 watts of whatever it is that you want via the charge connector in the back. That is optional in the Hyundai, not included from the factory. With so many similarities and the same tire size, how does the EV6 go further on a charge? That all has to do with aerodynamics. Starting with the roof height. Over here in the Ioniq 5, it's already a bit lower than a Hyundai Tucson, but the EV6 has a roof line about 2 inches lower than that. So if you're looking for a more upright seating position and more headroom, you're going to want the Hyundai. When you take a look at the spec sheet, the Ioniq 5 has very similar headroom and shoulder room front and rear, but over here in the EV6, we lose about 4 inches of collective shoulder room in this area of the cabin versus the front seats. And that definitely means that the more comfortable rear seats are going to be over here in the Hyundai. That styling choice is really obvious when you look down the side of the vehicle. You can really see the pinched-in greenhouse that gives the EV6 a very distinctive and sexy look, but it definitely pinches that rear passenger and cargo area in. First, let's talk about seat comfort, then we'll talk about seat design. The big difference between the EV6 and the Ioniq 5 is that the EV6 does not have the extended recline mode that we find in the Ioniq. Other than that, both seats are pretty comfortable, and honestly, after a 4-hour journey in either vehicle, they felt nearly identical to me. We have a manual tilt telescopic steering column in both vehicles, 2-position seat memory over there for the driver, and the front passenger seat in both trims is a power seat. And somewhat surprising, it has the same range of motion as the driver's seat, including the 2-way lumbar. The 2 big differences in the Ioniq are going to be the extending ottoman that is powered and the amount of headroom that we get. In this vehicle, I have really, honestly, almost about 3.5 inches more headroom than we find in the EV6. That means that if you'd rather sit in a more upright sitting position with your hips a little higher off the ground, you can do that in the Ioniq a little bit more easily. The big reason for that is right up here. It's the power opening sunroof that is available in the EV6. Now, this isn't standard. If you want more headroom inside, you can skip this and get a full 2 inches more headroom up front. But the funky sort of trumpet-shaped headrests for the driver and front passenger, those are only in the EV6. Both are 4-way adjustable, but the ones in the Ioniq 5 are a bit more normal shaped, and it's worth noting that the passenger side headrest in the Ioniq 5 does not adjust forward and backward, whereas in the EV6, it does. In the rear, things are relatively similar. I think that we do get a little bit more headroom here in practice than we find in the EV6. Legroom, actually you get a little bit more in the EV6, even though it has a shorter wheelbase. It just has to do with the way the interior has been laid out. Both vehicles feature reclining rear seats and USB ports in the back for the passengers. But in the Ioniq, those USB ports are not in the center console. Instead, they're in the seat back, and they're USB-C connectors rather than USB-A connectors. There's one on each seat back. One interesting point of differentiation, we have rear heated seats in the EV6, not available in the Ioniq 5, but in the Ioniq 5, we have integrated sunshades that are not available in the EV6. On the surface of things, you might think these two cargo areas are pretty similar. The width between the wheel wells is identical between these two vehicles, and that's really the only dimension that is. This cargo area doesn't have that sort of bulge in or bulge out that you find due to the tail lamp arrangement in the Ioniq 5, but the opening in the Ioniq 5 is considerably wider than in the EV6. And it all has to do with this sort of bell-shaped profile that we find on the side that we do not find in the Ioniq 5. Now, on the downside for cargo practicality, under the load floor in the Ioniq 5, we find for some reason the subwoofer right in the middle of everything there. So even though there is a lot of storage space available underneath the load floor, it's not in the best location. Over here in the EV6, it may appear due to this particular profile that reminds me a lot of an Audi A7 that this might actually have a longer cargo area than the Ioniq 5, but I measure it, that's not true. The EV6 cargo area is actually just 1 inch shorter. But under the load floor, we find a very square and level cargo area. No subwoofer holding things up here because the extra overhang that we find in the EV6 allowed them to put that subwoofer behind the rear axle and rear motor drive unit. Outside the wheel wells, the cargo area in the Ioniq 5 is definitely wider than the one in the EV6. Even though we were able to only fit the same 4 24-inch roller bags in either of these vehicles, there was enough room in the Ioniq 5 to also accommodate a 22-inch roller bag, and you could not do the same over there in the EV6. On the inside, we should talk about the LCDs in the dash first, because these are essentially the same in either of these vehicles. We have full-screen Apple CarPlay or Android Auto support, but not wireless CarPlay or wireless Android in either vehicle. I do think that's a bit of an odd move. Mainly because of where the USB cable is located. It's right down there, sort of in the footwell area in both vehicles. But again, we'll take a look at that in a bit. The EV-specific screens are basically the same in either of these options. They show you the battery percentage there. You can adjust some vehicle to load settings there. If we hit the configure button, you can change the DC max charge percentage, AC max charge percentage. You can also adjust the AC charging current there, but you don't have as much granularity as you do in some other vehicles. Winter mode is important if you operate in an area with temperatures maybe below about 45 or 50 degrees and you want to DC fast charge your battery quickly, you need to keep it enabled. Utility mode essentially allows this to act as a big battery pack with that vehicle to load functionality for extended periods of time, say if you're camping, etc. This range estimate is dynamic, so if I engage the various drive modes, you'll notice that it will shrink or it will lengthen based on the drive mode that you're in. For the instrument cluster and the infotainment system, you can choose a black theme or a white theme, or you can choose that the vehicle will automatically switch. Although there are slight variations in the themes themselves, you can adjust either vehicle between the 3 stock themes. And of course, you have access to things like trip computer readouts, turn-by-turn navigation directions, and the power split for the electric motor setup. There's a little bit of funkiness in either vehicle when it comes to the climate control buttons. In the Kia, we get one bank of buttons that acts double duty for infotainment controls. You can see this turns to a power volume knob. If I select that again, that turns into the power and the temperature control knob. And then this section right here is a touchscreen LCD giving us those various different buttons. Again, the USB port is under that center console. We have a USB interface port for the infotainment system, a USB-C charge-only port. Both vehicles have a very large glove compartment right there. The dashboard style changes a little bit, lots of ambient lighting going on in both vehicles. And then over here we have sort of a spaceship-y style console right between the front seats. It's not adjustable. Touch buttons or physical buttons depending on the trim level you get for the ventilated seats, heated steering wheel. There's the power button there, rotary shift knob for the vehicle, auto brake hold, Qi wireless charging mat, 2 big cup holders, and then a center armrest with storage underneath. Then a really big storage cubby right there between the front seats. There's also another charge port and a 12-volt power port there as well. As far as upholstery goes, the Kia offers a combination imitation leather and imitation suede setup, which is what we have in this model. There's also just an imitation leather seat if you'd rather have that. Over on the doors and on the dashboard, you'll notice that this one has a Meridian audio system in it. I definitely prefer the sound of this Meridian system to the Bose system that is in the Ioniq 5, but as we'll talk about a little bit later, you should know that the Kia is a little bit more expensive. As far as steering wheels go, the one in the Kia is perhaps a little bit more traditional since it has the Kia logo in there, and we have just two stalks on the back of the wheel, one for the headlights and turn signals, and one over there for the windshield wipers. On the face of the steering wheel, the controls are largely similar, although the drive mode button is a little bit better integrated, I think, into the airbag rather than that kind of funky little pop-off thing there. We have the controls for the adaptive cruise control, which is standard on both, and the lane centering system standard on both, buttons to control that multifunction LCD cluster, and then mode and volume up-down for the infotainment system. Both vehicles offer a full-color heads-up display, and the functionality is quite similar. This has the latest augmented reality function from the Hyundai Kia Envelope. You'll also see this kind of augmented reality heads-up display in the upcoming Genesis models. Here's the instrument cluster inside the Ioniq 5. You can see it changing the modes there from Sport to Eco to Normal. You can either link or unlink those different themes to the drive mode. The most interesting thing about the Ioniq 5 is the steering wheel in a way, because it does not have a Hyundai logo on it. Instead, it just has 4 dots. It appears that's what we're going to be seeing in all the Ioniq branded vehicles, because this is sort of a sub-brand for Hyundai. Lots of stalks on the back of the steering wheel, as you can see right there. This one is the shifter over here on this side. If I move the steering wheel out of the way, you can kind of see a little bit better there. It has an end that you rotate around, so that's drive, that's reverse, and then park is the button right there at the end. Again, same sort of instrument cluster and LCD infotainment system there, and again, something a little funny with the climate controls. So these are physical buttons for the most part for the climate controls, and then these buttons up here are dedicated buttons for the infotainment system. But if you want to adjust the seat heating or ventilation or heated steering wheel, you have to press that button. Then we come up here, go to the front warmer ventilation, then we can adjust the seat heating, ventilation, or that steering wheel heating. There is another way into that. You can actually just hit the home menu button and choose the warmer/ventilation option. That does seem a little bit silly to me. I just wish we had an extra few buttons in both of these vehicles. Down below those controls, you can see that we have a storage cubby, whereas we don't find one in the Kia. The center console in this vehicle slides forward and backward. You can grab that handle, drag that forward and backward. There's a bit less of a Starship Enterprise theme going on here, so no buttons, no shifter here. Instead, we just get this padded center armrest with a bit of additional storage, and then a big storage well right there between the seats. And for some reason, no USB-C charge ports in here at all. Here we just get 2 USB charge ports, regular ones, Qi wireless charging mat right there up front. You can see that in here we have the imitation leather upholstery, ventilated seats up front, of course, but no imitation suede available. Also very different is this large panoramic glass roof. It does not open like the one in the Kia, so if you'd rather have a bigger glass roof but give up the opening, you should choose the Ioniq. If you want something that actually opens, you're going to need the Kia. In keeping with the supposed sportier vibe of the EV6, we have metal pedals, brake and accelerator, and traditional rubber pedals over in the Ioniq 5, but you can see that both of them have that very flat floor. On the outside, the Hyundai and the Kia might look pretty different, but out on the road, they honestly drive very, very much like one another. In fact, shockingly like one another. Now, you might have heard reviews out there that said, oh, the Kia is a little bit more aggressive, or it feels a little bit firmer, or the handling feels a little bit sharper, etc. I may have even said that at the launch of the EV6, but honestly, driving these two vehicles back to back, just hopping from one to the other on the exact same road surface, there is incredibly little difference. Let's talk about acceleration times. Both of these models went 0 to 60 in 4.4 seconds. Both of them, if they're in eco mode, that'll take a little bit over 6.5 seconds to do 0 to 60 because they use the exact same motors. They also use basically the same tire sizes, even though they don't use the exact same tire compound. Now that is one area of difference between these two vehicles. Kia and Hyundai chose different vendors for the tires in the vehicles, even though they're the same size. The base tire size is still wider than we find in something like a Mach-E, and the curb weight is lower. So both of these vehicles will handle well, whether we're talking about the all-wheel drive version or the rear-wheel drive version and the base trim or the very top-end trim. Keep in mind, these two vehicles were the top-end trims. That tire compound difference is likely why the Kia did stop a little bit shorter from 60 miles an hour back to 0, 117 feet versus 120 feet, but honestly, 3 feet of difference in a 60 to 0 stopping distance, it's probably just within the margin of error. So, to be honest, very little difference right there. In terms of handling ability, the grip is shockingly identical as well. When I take a look at skid pad numbers from people that do have access to a skid pad, they're pretty darn similar, and just in person, the way they feel, the way they behave out on the road, very, very much the same. Ride quality, essentially identical as well. I do think that the steering in the EV6 feels a tiny bit better than the Ioniq 5, but that could simply be due to the tire difference, because again, different tires in these two vehicles, the ratios, they're very, very similar. So these two vehicles get to 60 in the same time, they stop from 60 in the same distance, they both handle well, and they both ride very similarly. What is the big difference? Well, it all comes down to road noise and efficiency. The Ioniq 5 is just a hair louder out on the road. On the same day, on the same road surface, I measured 70.5 decibels. In the EV6, 70 decibels, although honestly, half a decibel is not a huge difference. The bigger difference is efficiency. The EV6 is EPA rated for about 20 miles more EPA range than the Ioniq 5, and that all has to do with the aerodynamic profile of the vehicle. If you're doing a lot of city driving, a lot of stop-and-go driving, or slow-and-go driving, there's not going to be a lot of difference. They'll both take you about the same distance, as long as we're talking about the models with similar tire sizes. As speeds ramp up when you're going 65, 70, or 75 miles an hour, you'll notice an increasing difference between these two vehicles, simply due to the better aerodynamic profile of the EV6. But as always, there are pros and cons. It's that really boat tail sort of shape, I guess you'd say, where we have that drastically pinched in greenhouse towards the rear that really improves the aerodynamic profile of the EV6, but it makes it less practical than the boxy profile that we find in the Ioniq 5. Bottom lining these two vehicles out on the road is easier than I thought at the beginning. If you were to put identical tires in these vehicles, I suspect they would feel exactly the same, and as it is, they are incredibly similar. One really does not have the advantage over the other when it comes to handling or ride quality, or honestly cabin noise either, acceleration braking, all very, very similar, but you will have a bit of an efficiency toll if you choose the boxier option. Now that's pretty logical, and I think ultimately it's just going to depend on exactly what kind of range you need and whether you plan on road tripping your EV regularly or whether you'd rather have that boxier and more practical cargo area and the slightly more accommodating back seat. When it comes to pricing, you may be surprised to hear that the Kia is more expensive than the Hyundai. This starts at $40,900 for the base model with the small battery pack and just 168 horsepower, although it is still rear-wheel drive, which is an interesting twist. The Ioniq 5, on the other hand, starts at $39,950, and that price differential continues all the way up to the top. If you want the 225 horsepower rear-wheel drive model, which is going to give you the longest range in either of these vehicles, but narrower tires than we find on either of these options, that would be $44,000 on the Hyundai, $47,000 for the Kia. And if you want the all-wheel drive models, which is what I was driving today, the Kia starts at $50,900, the Ioniq 5 at $47,500. There are obviously some feature content differences between the Ioniq 5 and the EV6, but honestly not enough to really justify the price difference in my mind. Any way you slice it, the EV6 is going to be a slightly worse value, I would say, than the Ioniq 5, but both of them are incredible values for a mainstream electric vehicle. Key feature differences that you might be interested in between the two vehicles: the EV6 does not come standard with an EVSE, you have to buy one on your own, although I don't find that to be too much of a problem because the Ioniq 5 only comes with a level 1 EVSE, it's not a dual voltage cord, and if you want to charge either of these at a speed greater than about 3 miles an hour of charge rate, you're going to want to get your own EVSE. The EV6 has heated rear seats, the Ioniq 5 has rear window shades, this has an opening sunroof that has a large panoramic glass roof. This model has the imitation suede seats, whereas the Hyundai only has imitation leather. Both models have their own peculiar quirks when it comes to the human interface on the inside. I'm not a fan of either of these models when it comes to that particular quirk. I wish that both of them had just a few more buttons. I would love it if that one had separate seat heating and ventilation buttons for the front seats, and I would love it if this one had the infotainment button bank just ripped right out of the Ioniq 5. Obviously, the EV6 is going to give you a little bit less cargo room and a little bit less rear passenger area, but it's not an enormous difference, and in terms of actual luggage capacity, these two vehicles are shockingly similar. In my road trip range test, both models fell short of their EPA range estimate, but the difference between the range estimate and reality was larger in the Ioniq 5 than it was in the EV6. And that logically has to do with wind resistance, because a lot of that test is at highway speeds, whether that's a rural highway at 55 miles an hour or 65 miles an hour, or out on the interstate going 70 to 75 miles an hour. This is more aerodynamic, so if you're doing that sort of road tripping in your EV, know that this is going to give you longer range than the boxy shape that we find in the Ioniq. But if you're doing a lot of in-city driving, a lot of stop-and-go driving, there's not going to be an enormous difference. And that's really the takeaway here, is that they may be styled differently, but substantively, these vehicles are very, very similar. And it's absolutely hard to go wrong with either of them, which is why, for me, choosing between them was so difficult. Both of them charge very rapidly, both of them have a lot of modern features on them, both of them have a long standard warranty. And both of them are very style-forward EVs, whether you're looking for something that's a bit sportier, a little bit more pointy in the front, or you want something that is boxy and practical, but no less modern, no less exciting over here in the Ioniq 5. Let me know what your choice would be down there in the comment section below. If I had to choose over again, I might get the Ioniq 5 simply because I like it so much, and I have had the EV6 for a while. I would probably prefer a world where I could just switch it up every month because, again, I like both of these EVs quite a lot. Let me know what you think of that as well down there in the comment section. And if you haven't already done so, find me over at Facebook, Instagram, all those other social places, and I'll see all of you later.